Thank you very much. Excellencies, dear colleagues, distinguished guests, good afternoon, and welcome to this special event which marks the formal observance at the United Nations of the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence and in Conflict, 19 June. It is an honor for Argentina to be hosting once again, together with the offices of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict and for Children and Armed Conflict, a special event in commemoration of this International Day. We are gathered here today to commemorate the International Day, whose objectives are to raise awareness of the need to prevent, put an end, and fight impunity of crime of the conflict-related sexual violence, foster solidarity with the survivors of sexual violence around the world, and to pay tribute to all those who are currently working on the front lines for the eradication of these crimes. As you recall, the International Day was established by the General Assembly in 2015 through its resolution 69293, which was an initiative put forward by the government of my country, Argentina. This commemoration is special in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. That is why the theme of this year observance is Building Back Better, supporting survivors of conflict-related sexual violence in the context of pandemic recovery. In that regard, we appreciate the latest report issued by the Secretary General, and we share the concern that the COVID-19 pandemic amplified gender inequality, which constitute one of the main causes of sexual violence, both in conflict and in peace context. Furthermore, the COVID-19 pandemic has a huge impact on the access of survivors of sexual violence to essential health services and to justice and reparation. We do believe that responses to fight COVID-19 must adopt a human rights basis, gender responsive, and survivor-centered approach in order to focus our attention on who are suffering most. With regard to the protection of victims of sexual violence in conflict, Argentina understands that it is essential to create mechanisms to protect, assist, and reintegrate all survivors of such violence in collaboration with women's organizations and other civil society members. In that sense, we would like to highlight the importance of having women protection advisors in peacekeeping operations in order to improve coordination and the information available for the monitoring and prevention of sexual violence in conflict. As it is mentioned in the 1325 Security Council landmark resolution, we must reaffirm the important role of women in the prevention and resolution of conflict and foster their equal participation and full involvement in all efforts for the promotion of peace and security. In effect, Resolution 1325 also called all parties to conflict to take special measures to protect women and girls from gender-based violence, particularly rape and other forms of sexual abuse in situations of armed conflict. At this point, 21 years after its adoption, we need to consider the implementation deficit and address especially the implementation gap that impacts on people's lives. Dear colleague, sexual violence in conflict is a despicable phenomenon that not only affects international peace and security, it is a human rights as well as a gender issue, as a scourge that affects every society and prevent its full and sustainable development, as well as the dignity, integrity, and human rights of each individual. We hope that today's event will help us in reflecting about this issue, bearing in mind the extraordinary circumstances we are facing and the steps and measures that are needed for putting an end of these crimes through a survivor-centered approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Mrs. Maria del Carmen Squef, Permanent Representative of Argentina to the United Nations. It is an honor to co-host this event with you and with the Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Children in Armed Conflict. Distinguished guests and participants, we are marking this International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict against the backdrop of overlapping crises. What began as a global health crisis has also deepened existing challenges of displacement, institutional fragility, structural gender-based inequality, and insecurity, rendering survivors vulnerable to re-victimization at a time when avenues for reporting and redress are more restricted than ever. Tragically, sexual violence remains in the headlines. Since we met at this moment last year, new conflicts have erupted in which sexual violence has been deployed by perpetrators whose crimes will reverberate down generations, threatening both individual and international security. In Tigray, women and girls are being subjected to sexual violence with a level of cruelty beyond comprehension. Despite the Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire, sexual violence continues to be used as a cruel tactic of war, torture, and political repression to gain ground, extract resources, and dominate or forcibly displace populations. Today's event is an opportunity to take stock of progress towards our common goal of eliminating sexual violence in conflict with a clear-eyed look at the appalling resource gaps on the ground. It is an opportunity amidst multiple complex crises to ensure that the voices and choices of survivors of sexual violence are integrated into national, regional, and global pandemic recovery plans and backed with the necessary political resolve and resources to tackle the problem. Today, we will hear the perspective of a resolute advocate, the First Lady of the Democratic Republic of the Congo and global champion for the fight against sexual violence in conflict, Mrs. Denise Nyakeru-Tshisekedi, that of a United Nations agency supporting reproductive health care and gender-based violence service provision through the Executive Director of UNFPA, Dr. Natalia Kanem, and of civil society represented by Mrs. Kavya Asuka, Executive Director of the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace and Security. We will also hear directly from a survivor, Mrs. Eklas Baju from Iraq. Building back better requires an understanding of both persistent and emerging challenges. Over the past year, existing structural, institutional, and sociocultural barriers to reporting and accessing services have been exacerbated by pandemic containment measures and economic shocks. With cautious optimism, we must begin to formulate recovery plans, even though COVID-19 continues to spread, including in many of the countries covered by the mandate. In conflict-affected settings such as Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, facing crippling economic effects, families have turned to early and forced marriage in a desperate attempt to protect their daughters from sexual violence. The pandemic has exposed and exacerbated a range of inequalities. Women and girls already marginalized will be left further and further behind unless we act. The lens of intersectionality is needed to bring the root causes of sexual violence into focus. Forms of inequality based on ethnic or political affiliation, age, disability, sexual orientation and gender identity, income and migratory status intersect and increase the risk faced by diverse individuals. So much is at stake. Protection is directly linked to participation and power. In many conflict settings, the nexus between sexual violence, conflict driven trafficking in persons, and violent extremism deepens insecurity. New gender based protection concerns have also surfaced, including reports of sexual violence against women detained for alleged violations of curfews, as well as by armed groups taking advantage of the pandemic to intensify their operations. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as those hardest hit by overlapping crises are often the hardest to reach, our data on the crime of conflict-related sexual violence can never present full global picture. Despite these challenges, women protection advisors deepened partnership this year with community-based networks and swiftly pivoted to virtual approaches, thereby avoiding a data blackout. The monitoring and reporting of women protection advisors is a critical function of my mandate as it provides the foundation for targeted prevention and response. Their work should inform recovery planning too. Indeed, any discussion of long-term health measures and resilience in the face of further pandemics must include sexual and reproductive health services. Equally, plans for economic recovery should include survivors, not as passive beneficiaries, but rather as engaged participants. Just 1 year before the outbreak of the pandemic, the United Nations Security Council adopted Resolution 2467, which articulated the importance of a survivor-centered approach in all prevention and response efforts. A survivor-centered approach is integral to transformative pandemic recovery. Building back better means developing proactive measures to ensure an enabling environment for survivors to safely come forward and seek redress. Such, a, Such an approach would not only advance the rights and needs of survivors, but would also enrich recovery by introducing a range of often neglected voices and perspectives, helping to lay the groundwork for sustainable and inclusive peace and development. Allow me to conclude with three concrete recommendations for a survivor-centered approach to pandemic recovery. Firstly, we need to move boldly towards gender equality and to address the root causes of sexual violence in conflict. We cannot and should not return to the pre-pandemic status quo, but instead promote a new social contract in which no one is left behind and everyone is heard. Secondly, our response must be comprehensive, multi-sectoral, and age-appropriate. It must include life-saving medical care, sexual and reproductive health services, psychosocial and socio-economic reintegration support, and access to justice. Service coverage must reach survivors in rural, remote, and border areas, as well as in refugees and displacement settings. Thirdly, we need to shift to investing in public welfare rather than the instruments of warfare. We need to foster human security and the resilience of individuals, including survivors and their communities, to social and economic shocks. Finally, I wish to express my profound gratitude to Argentina, whose leadership and vision were essential to establishing this International Day, which is now widely commemorated the world over. As multiple crises shift the ground beneath us, We must seize this opportunity to build back better by tackling the root causes of sexual violence in conflict. In this transformative moment, we must aim high. Survivors must be heard and heeded by national authorities and policymakers as part of an intersectional, gender responsive pandemic recovery. Thank you for your attention. I now have the pleasure to give the floor to my co-host, Under Secretary General Virginia Gamba.
Thank you very much. Her Excellency, the Permanent Representative of Argentina to the United Nations, Señora María del Carmen Esquef. Special Representative, my friend on sexual violence conflict, Mrs. Pramila Patten, and Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm honored to join you today to commemorate the 2021 International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict, and to share reflections on how to address conflict-related sexual violence, especially against children, under COVID-19 response and recovery plans. As you know, rape and other forms of sexual violence against girls and boys is one of the 6 grave violations we monitor as requested by the Security Council, along with the killing and maiming of children, the recruitment and use, abduction, attacks on schools and hospitals, and the denial of humanitarian access. This violation is also a trigger for the inclusion of parties to conflict in the annexes of the annual report of the Secretary General on Children and Armed Conflict. In 2019, our task forces on monitoring and reporting on the ground verified 735 cases of rape and other forms of sexual violence against children in the 19 situations covered by my agenda on that year. About 98% of these violations affected girls. By 2020, these figures have risen by 70%, with most victims being girls. But we know that actual figures are likely much higher, as this is the most underreported grave violation, mostly due to stigma, fear of reprisals, lack of accountability for perpetrators, and of resources for survivors. Due to the unrelentless growth of this particular violation against children, my office is undertaking currently a study to assess the gender dimension of the impact of armed conflict on children, and more specifically on all 6 grave violations, including sexual violence. This analysis is necessary, as the Secretary General's annual report on children and armed conflict covering 2020, which will be published in just a few days' time, and as I already indicated, highlights a dramatic increase in verified sexual violence cases in 2020, including since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Despite the calls by the Secretary General, the Security Council and many others for a global ceasefire in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, many conflicts have intensified and others have erupted. My office recently published a study on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on violations against children in situations of armed conflict, which shows that the first month of the pandemic challenged the United Nations capacity to monitor and verify grave violations, and in particular, rape and other forms of sexual violence, beyond the traditional structural, institutional, and socio-cultural barriers to reporting this violation, from stigmatization to fear of reprisals, quarantine and lockdown measures to contain the pandemic have imposed additional challenges, physically preventing many survivors from reaching out. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the pandemic and related response has had staggering consequences on children, including a spike in conflict-related sexual violence incidents, and yet survivors have been left out of response efforts. It is our collective responsibility that barriers impeding survivors to seek redress for such crimes are overcome, comprehensive services are made available, and that survivors can participate in the development and the implementation of post-COVID-19 recovery plans. Despite being impacted by the pandemic, our monitoring and reporting teams have continued to verify violations all through 2020 and to date. Adapting and finding creative yet effective ways to facilitate reporting is of the utmost importance, while always prioritizing survivors' wishes, confidentiality, and safety. The ways in which our monitoring and reporting field staff have overcome the challenges imposed by the pandemic are also now being studied as best practice. For instance, the Child Protection Section in one peacekeeping mission successfully systematized data consolidation exercises on sexual violence against children with other mission sections, including through a very good, effective coordination with women's protection advisors. Training of non-governmental organizations and local civil society organizations was also strengthened to reinforce their capacity to monitor and report sexual violence because they have better access to survivors. Furthermore, the study also showed the importance of collecting data which is age and gender disaggregated to integrate the specific rights, needs, and perspectives of boys and girls into national and regional COVID-19 response and recovery plans. There are many concerning aspects to the current situation that also were highlighted by our analysis. Shelters, medical, psychological, and legal services for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence have regrettably been deprioritized so far in the COVID-19 response to make them almost negligible. They must be considered as life-saving and maintained as a high priority in any COVID-19 response and recovery plan. And their availability should be widely communicated. I am also concerned about the plight of children born because of rape in conflict, who face distinct, sometimes life-threatening and enduring risks and harms, and have specific needs that we need to respond to. I am very pleased to support the efforts led by my colleague, Special Representative Patton, to compile a special report of the Secretary General on this subject as requested by the Security Council. Lastly, in order to better protect children sexually used and abused by, in, and for armed conflict, it is essential that we focus on key areas such as strengthening accountability measures as essential to end cultures of impunity and ultimately prevent the occurrence of sexual violence in conflict. Secondly, the work of monitoring and reporting teams, child protection advisors, and women protection advisors, as well as service providers, should be recognized as an essential service, prioritized and adequately funded. Thirdly, there is urgent necessity to increase human and financial resources to ensure that we access child survivors, hear their stories, and secure the support they desperately need. I strongly hope that this 7th annual commemoration will spark decisive change and that all children survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, both boys and girls, will be able to receive tailored, gender-sensitive, and age-appropriate services. The post-pandemic world can only be built back better by including those affected the most. This is an imperative for societies if they wish to thrive and for peace to last. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Carmen, SRSG Patton, SRSG Gamba. First and foremost, I'd like to thank you for your leadership in this field and for your comprehensive framing of today's commemoration. I'm Tondorai Chikua, Chief of Staff in the Office of the Special Representative on Sexual Violence and Conflict. And it's my honor and pleasure to moderate the second segment of our commemoration today, which will begin with a brief video message by Her Excellency, the First Lady of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Madame Denise Nyakero Tshisekedi, who was appointed in 2019 by SRSG Pattern as a global champion on conflict-related sexual violence. Technicians, please roll the statement.
Mesdames et Messieurs, distingués participants, en vos qualités et titres respectifs, je vous remercie pour l'occasion que vous m'offrez de participer virtuellement à cette rencontre. J'aurais bien aimé être physiquement avec vous, mais cela n'a pas été possible pour les raisons de Covid qui perturbent si fortement notre vie. Cette action contre les formes de violence que les hommes et les filles ou garçons, et dans certains cas, sont malheureusement oubliés. Le monde n'est pas au courant de ce qui se passe, et c'est de notre devoir de faire le plus de et d'attirer l'attention sur ce mal. C'est là mon engagement comme championne globale unie sur les violences sexuelles liées ou constamment renforcées. L'engagement de lutte contre les violences sexuelles ne doit pas être le combat exclusif d'une catégorie. C'est un combat qui exige de nous tous une implication totale dès les premiers signes de conflit, soit-il à l'échelle de la communauté, celle qui pouvons qui peut commencer, nous ne saurons jamais à l'avance quand ni comment se clôturer, encore moins quel dégât il laisse sur son passage. La prévention est ainsi notre meilleure arme. L'idée de penser à la victime, je redouble l'énergie pour prendre le temps de parler encore une fois de violence et de conflit. Je me tiens à leur côté aux instants où le monde tente de se relever et de ses conséquences parties pour durer. La pandémie actuelle de la COVID-19 est la plus forte et les perturbations mondiales depuis la Seconde Guerre et ses répercussions sur la santé, l'économie et la sécurité se feront sentir. Nous devons être à la fois résilients dans notre combat pour nous protéger. Mesdames et messieurs, nous avons fait assez que l'on qualifié de guerre, pandémie de COVID-19. Le plein secteur de vie et notre disposition contre les violences, toutes les formes, ainsi mis en évidence les faiblesses majeures de la prévention des conflits, l'inadéquation entre les institutions existantes, les niveaux de financement et les futurs défis de prise en charge, particulièrement en période. Il est dans la recherche de premières solutions. Les mesures prises pour limiter la propagation de la maladie n'ont pas été pour les populations. Si par ces mesures, ont été sur notre continent, ils n'ont que la titre d'exemple, premièrement, les mesures de confinement et de couvre-feu ont sensiblement impacté les revenus des ménages, impliquant l'accroissement de la pauvreté, un des facteurs non négligeables de création de conflits et d'exposition à l'augmentation des cas de violence. Deuxièmement, les activités de sensibilisation faites par les organisations de la société civile n'étaient plus possibles ou fortement réduites, ce qui n'a pas permis de décourager les auteurs de violences. En dernier lieu, la pandémie a limité la possibilité pour les survivants de dénoncer les actes de violence. Dans plusieurs pays d'Afrique, la pandémie a eu des répercussions sur les capacités d'enregistrement des plaintes, sur le traitement des signalements, ainsi que sur la poursuite des dossiers en instance au niveau des juridictions nationales. Nous avions donc des survivants sous une pression psychosociale importante, car en attente pendant une longue durée de toute forme de réparation. Mais aussi la dissuasion des nouveaux cas qui passent par une justice justement appliquée et des sanctions exemplaires des bourreaux n'a pas été possible pendant ce moment. Mesdames et messieurs, maintenant que la pilule amère commence à passer, il est temps de redéfinir les priorités dans chacun de nos pays. Une dure leçon apprise de cette pandémie est que nous ne pouvons plus faire les choses comme par le passé. Nous devons sortir de notre zone de confort et surtout, nous ne devons pas limiter notre imagination dans la recherche de solutions durables. Car une crise dans la pourrait anéantir tous nos efforts consentis à ce jour envers le survivant. Je propose donc deux choses. Premièrement, la préservation des acquis devant la crise sanitaire et deuxièmement, de manière simultanée, l'application courageuse de nos propres décisions avant la pandémie. Des avancées notables avaient été constatées de textes et de comportements dans beaucoup de nos pays restés. Mon pays, la République démocratique du Congo, n'y était pas en reste. Je peux ainsi évoquer ici l'adoption par le gouvernement le 5 juin 2020 de la stratégie nationale de lutte contre les VBG, qui constitue un cadre de référence sur la lutte contre toute forme de violence, y compris celle liée au conflit. La mise en place des plans d'action de nos forces armées et de nos forces de police pour la lutte contre les violences sexuelles en vue d'assurer la politique de tolérance pour toutes les formes des violences causées par les forces de sécurité et de défense. La déclaration des chefs de l'État à la CIRGL à Kampala contre les violences sexuelles dans les pays de la région des Grands Lacs. La mobilisation des différents acteurs humanitaires pour appuyer le gouvernement afin d'assurer la mise en place des services de prise en charge médicale et psychosociale dans les différentes provinces affectées par les conflits et de sauver des vies des femmes, des filles et des garçons malgré les défis sécuritaires qui limitent l'accès aux populations vulnérables. La grosse difficulté demeure, et vous l'aurez compris, la mise en pratique des belles résolutions prises, à savoir que dans la majeure partie des cas, l'insécurité généralement causée par des groupes armés armées ou le faible niveau des ressources à la résolution des conflits, leurs conséquences liées à l'inaction sont les Je tiens à ces mesures prises par le gouvernement de mon pays afin aux conflits armés dans les provinces de l'Ituri et Mesdames et messieurs participants, j'ai pris l'engagement en tant que championne de mise en place d'un fonds de réparation de violences sexuelles en période de conflit dans mon pays. Et après que vous me soutiendrez dans cette... Mais je ne pense pas qu'il y ait une solution unique, suffisante, qui plaît à tous. Il y a des particularités que chaque pays doit envisager les mesures communes déjà prises ou restant. La réponse à envisager sera multisectorielle et impliquerait plusieurs acteurs. Difficulté demeurera la coordination des nos réflexions devrait également se pencher sur cette sous peine de me répéter. Je me perds sur le fait que nous devrions continuer à travailler en restant focalisés sur le intervenir déjà au conflit, car les conflits, quels qu'ils soient, indéniables des violences diverses. Deuxièmement, sensibiliser les populations afin des réflexes tels qu'une masculinité positive et la vie humaine. Troisièmement, créer un réseau de jeunes influenceurs afin d'inclure activement notre jeune génération dans le dispositif de lutte et de façonner en eux très tôt une mentalité anti-violence. Dans la prise de décision les concernant et beaucoup plus juste et plus incisive à préjudice causé. Enfin, miser au maximum les plus faibles, car la pauvreté est une source primaire des conflits et des violences. Pour clore mon propos, j'émets le souhait que les échanges de ce jour nous permettent d'égaliser efficiente et pourquoi pas non encore tenté ou imagine jusqu'à présent. Nous devons tout tenter pour arrêter ce fléau. Il y va de notre dignité, il y va de l'avenir de nos nations, celle de l'humanité tout entière. Mesdames et messieurs, je vous remercie.
I would like to apologize for the problems with the audio. The technicians assure us that they're working on this for some further video statements. In the meantime, I would like to let you know that we will post the video message of Her Excellency, the First Lady, on the website of the Office of the Special Representative on Sexual Violence and Conflict.
Mesdames et messieurs,
moving on.
Participants.
Moving on, I'm very glad to give once again the floor to SRSG Pramila Patton to introduce a new publication, a digital book, which is a continuation of the commitment towards a survivor-centered approach for this mandate. Madam Patton, the floor is yours.
Thank you, moderator. It's my great honor and pleasure today to launch the digital book of testimonies by survivors and service providers entitled, in their own words, Voices of Survivors of Conflict-Related Sexual Violence and Service Providers. I have long prioritized first-hand encounters with survivors and affected communities as a means to ensure survivor-centered prevention and response. This book is a continuation of these efforts in the COVID era when field visits have been suspended. The aim is to ensure survivors' perspectives and concerns feed in policy and decision-making forums. In complement to the data presented in the annual report of the Secretary General on conflict-related sexual violence, this compilation illustrates that behind every statistic, there is a mother, son, daughter, sister, or friend. This unique anthology spans a dozen countries and includes more than 150 testimonies from conflicts ranging between 1992 to the present. In addition to survivors, service providers on the front lines, who are often under-resourced, also share their accounts. Gathered by United Nations Women Protection Advisors, United Nations partners in the field, and civil society organizations, the testimonies are presented exactly as we received them, unedited and unabridged. The testimonies demonstrate the incalculable human cost of war's cheapest weapon, but they also include specific proposals. I've always been struck by the quality and far-sighted nature of the recommendations made by survivors, and this book is no exception. Survivors' risk mitigation proposals include avoiding troop deployments close to civilian population centers, safely locating water points and wells, deploying patrols of police and trained peacekeepers, and issuing command orders to prohibit sexual violence, in addition to the need for stricter laws and better implementation. It is evident that in addition to responding to sexual violence when it occurs, survivors focused on eradicating it altogether, so that in the words of one contributor, no other woman has to go through what I went through. The compilation challenges the notion that social norms, attitudes, and taboos around honor, shame, and victim blame are immutable. Many testimonies point to evolving attitudes of acceptance, which encourage reintegration. It is possible to shift the stigma from the victim to the perpetrator and send a clear signal that the only shame of rape is in committing, commanding, or condoning it. The resilience of survivors is striking. I think of Noor, a young woman living in Cox's Bazar refugee camp, who was abducted and raped for her activism in promoting women's leadership. She writes, "The sexual violence I endured broke my heart and mind, not my spirit. I am persistent." We must all persist in showing solidarity and support for the survivors. I am now honored to introduce a contributor to the digital book, Ms. Eklas Baju, a 20-year-old Yazidi woman from the Sinjar district of Iraq, who has recorded a message for this commemoration. After 6 months of brutal rape in ISIS captivity, during which she attempted suicide 4 times, she finally managed to escape. Hers is a long journey, from an initial refusal to speak about her experience to the decision to share her story widely in the hope of giving voice to others. Her story is one of more than 150 testimonies that feature in the digital book. Let us listen to her message.
مرحبا بكم جميعا، أتمنى من الرب تكونوا بخير. أنا فتاة عراقية من الديانة الإيزيدية، اسمي إخلاص باتشو. كنت واحدة من الضحايا داعش بسنة 2014 وقت اللي دخلوا داعش على السنجار وقبضوا على الإيزيديين اللي في سنجار. خطفوا آلاف من الإيزيديين وقتلوا آلاف من الإيزيديين. خطفوني ويا عائلتي، قتلوا بابا أمامي وأخذوني من أمي لأن عمري 14 سنة وصغيرة. أخذوني ويا 500 بنت إيزيدية أخرى على سوق الصبايا. تعرضنا على أبشع الجرائم. إجا أحد عناصر تنظيم داعش عمره 34 سنة، اختارني من بين 150 بنت. أخذني وياه وتعرضت على أبشع الجرائم بإيده، على أبشع اغتصاب. كل يوم اغتصاب، كل يوم ضرب، كل يوم إهانة. ما خلى شيء ما سوى بيا. وصلت لمرحلة طلبت منه أن يقتلني، ولكن ضحك علي وقال لي لا، أنتم الآزدين الموت قليلة بحقكم، أنتم لازم تموتوا عايشين. حاولت الانتحار أكثر من مرة وكل مرة كنت أفشل. وأنا قلت أنا ليش لحتى أقتل روح أنطاني رب العالمين؟ صار عندي أمل برب العالمين وإيماني كان أقوى منهم كلهم. وتعاونت ويا صديقاتي الناجيات اللي كانوا ضحايا، تعاوننا ويا بعض، مسكنا بإيد بعض. صحيح حاولنا الهروب 3 مرات وفشلنا، ولكن إيماننا كان أقوى منهم وكان عندنا أمل بالحياة، ما استسلمنا. ومرة الرابعة الحمد لله تحررنا من إيد، ولا ما تحررت ما استسلمت، لأن كان عندي هدف. لازم أوصل صوت الناجيات لكل العالم، لازم أوصل صوت كل المظلومين لكل العالم، لأن أنا اليوم أملهم كلهم. وبدأت بالمعالجة النفسية، اتعالجت كتير، تعبت بالمعالجة كتير مرات، كنت أبكي كتير مرات، كنت أمرض من التعب، ولكن ما استسلمت لأن كان عندي هدف بالحياة. والحمد لله اليوم وصلت لهدفي. اليوم أنا ويا المنظمات، ويا أكثر من منظمة، أساعد صديقاتي بالمعالجة النفسية. اليوم أنا مو بس أمل وصوت لناجيات الإيزيدين، أنا صوت لكل الناجيات ولكل الضحايا ولكل المظلومين. وبهذا اليوم أريد أشكر الأمم المتحدة لأن اختاروني أن أشارك وياكم قصدي وأوصل صوتنا بيوم العالمي ضد العنف. وأريد أيضا أشكر الأمم المتحدة لأن أعطوني الفرصة لأشارك بهذا الكتاب المميز اللي يجمعنا إحنا الناجيات كأخوات. لأن اليوم إحنا الناجيات كأخوات لازم نمسك بإيد بعض ولازم نحارب ويا بعض لحتى نوصل للعدالة. ولكن لحتى احنا نوصل للعدالة محتاجين دعمكم، محتاجين هاي الإنسانية اللي عندكم لحتى نوصل للعدالة. لأن اليوم أنا أؤمن بيكم وأنتم اليوم أمل لكل المظلومين. مسير أكثر من 3000 مخطوف بإيدكم أنتم، ومصير كل الناجيات بإيدكم. فأمسكوا بإيدنا وخلينا نحارب ويا بعض لحتى نوقف هذا الظلم اللي جالسين بحقنا وبحق جميع المظلومين. أتمنى من الرب أن كلياتكم توقفوا ويا المظلومين ويا الناجيات لحتى ويا بعض نوصل للعدالة. وتحياتي لكم جميعا.
With that sobering testimony, I'm happy to introduce a video statement by the Executive Director of UNFPA, Dr. Natalia Kanem. UNFPA is one of the 19 UN entities forming UN action against sexual violence and a critical partner in the field as the lead of the gender-based violence area of responsibility of the protection cluster. Technicians, please roll Madame Kanem's.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I'm pleased to join you to commemorate the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict. As we meet, the unprecedented frequency, intensity, and scope of humanitarian emergencies have dramatically amplified the risks for millions of women and girls. UNFPA remains gravely concerned about the continued use of sexual violence as a tactic of war and political repression. A year ago, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres urged parties to conflict across the world to lay down their weapons in support of the bigger battle against the COVID-19 pandemic. Ending sexual violence should be part of that ceasefire. We desperately need peace in the home, and that includes in tents, camps, and other sites for people affected by conflict. In 2020, UNFPA reached nearly 5 million people with services for gender-based violence prevention and response. as the lead agency of gender-based violence response coordination in emergencies. UNFPA works closely with women-led organizations. These are the organizations that help us to ensure access to life-saving services and information. All survivors of gender-based violence have the right to assistance, to support, and to justice. Yet, women are not just passive victims or survivors. We all must support their leadership. Theirs are the voices that must be at the heart of our efforts to end sexual violence and conflict. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, I met Larisse, who was raped by 5 men on her way home from a food distribution site. She was so severely beaten that she spent 5 months in the hospital. She told me, "The men broke my body and shattered my soul, and I listened as women after woman recounted similar stories of the horrible, heavy price they pay with their rights, their bodies, and their lives." These women were emboldened to call for change. They want a greater voice in decision-making related to their safety and protection. And they asked me to share their demands for action with the network of colleagues devoted to protection from sexual violence and exploitation. And I did that. Such feedback mechanisms are essential to protect women's rights and deliver justice. And we must do more. We must do more to end sexual violence and conflict, including addressing root causes, gender inequality, and shifting the burden of shame and stigma from the person who survives to the one who is the perpetrator. Let's strengthen our collective response and prioritize the devastating and disproportionate impact of sexual violence on women and girls. Let's put them at the center of our efforts to advance human rights. That's how we will achieve transformative change. Thank you.
The strong and consistent consensus amongst member states in support of the Children and Armed Conflict Agenda and the Sexual Violence in Conflict Agenda is a hallmark and critical ingredient of these agendas. I'm delighted to give the floor to a number of representatives of regional groups and member states, the EU, Sweden on behalf of the Nordic countries, the Netherlands, Ireland, Liechtenstein, Japan, and the Ukraine, to give expression to the support and consensus around these agendas. Deputy Head of EU Delegation, Silvio Gonzato, Excellency, the floor is yours.
Yes, so everything is informed. Sorry, Olaf, I think I have to speak. Sorry. Thank you. Sorry, I think I missed your introduction. I would like to thank Argentina and the special representatives of the Secretary General for organizing this important event, and we are particularly grateful to Denise Niakeru, Tshisekedi, and all the other briefers for their testimonies. The EU is really a proud supporter of the International Fund for Survivors of Conflict-Related Sexual Violence, and we work closely with Dr. Denis Mukwege and Nadia Murad to end sexual and gender-based violence in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Iraq, and all other countries affected by conflict. On this International Day, we reiterate our absolute condemnation of conflict-related sexual violence. We stand by all victims and survivors and remain fully committed to ensuring accountability and justice. As underlined by the EU High Representative Josep Borrell and SRSG Pamela Pratten in a joint statement, it is high time that all parties involved in conflict heed the Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire and immediately end all acts of sexual and gender-based violence. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed where we have failed. Despite important commitments, gender-based violence is on the rise, and parties to conflict continue to use sexual and gender-based violence as a weapon of war. The recent developments in the Tigray region of Ethiopia are a stark reminder of the scale and persistence of this abject phenomenon. Reports from the ground show a pattern of widespread and systematic sexual violence perpetrated by men in uniform who have no fear of repercussions or justice. It is essential that all parties adhere to a ceasefire immediately and respect their obligations under international humanitarian law. All sexual and gender-based violence crimes should be investigated and prosecuted, and we must act to stop impunity. Children born of rape and their mothers continues to face discrimination, stigmatization, and violence. More needs to be done to address their situation, including by ensuring that children born out of rape are considered eligible for citizenship and support, including adequate counseling and medical care. Human rights are always most at risk in times of crisis. The EU remains committed to the promotion, protection, and fulfillment of all human rights, and to the full and effective implementation of the Beijing Platform for Action and the Program of Action of the International Conference on Population and Development, and the outcomes of their review conferences. And it remains committed to sexual and reproductive health and rights in this context. We are ready to step up efforts to support these rights whenever and wherever they are being challenged. The Security Council has adopted a comprehensive framework to address conflict-related sexual violence, and we call on Council members to use all instruments at their disposal to ensure its implementation, including by imposing sanctions for those responsible for conflict-related sexual violence. Tangible and accelerated progress across all pillars of the Women, Peace and Security agenda is the only way forward. To be effective, our actions need to be accompanied by a genuine paradigm shift in all our societies. Achieving gender equality and ensuring women and girls full, equal, and meaningful participation in all spheres of life is more urgent than ever. We commend the essential contributions of civil society, women human rights defenders, and women peace builders in this regard. And we look forward to the high-level meeting of the Generation Equality Forum in Paris on June the 30th to 2nd of July, which will provide an opportunity to accelerate the work to end sexual violence in peacetime, as well as during conflict, by mobilizing states and other stakeholders. I thank you very much for your attention, and apologies for the literacy.
I'd like to thank the Chargé d'Affaires of the EU delegation for his statement, and I'm delighted to give the floor to the permanent representative of Sweden, Anna-Karin Eneström. Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Excellent pronunciation of a Swedish name there. Thank you very much. I am delivering this statement on behalf of the Nordic countries, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and my own country, Sweden. Let me start by thanking the organizer for this meeting at a critical time and the briefers for the crucial work and powerful statements. Around the world, particularly in conflict and crisis-affected contexts, sexual and gender-based violence continues to be perpetrated in a widespread and often systematic way. It is also used as a tactic of war and silencing tool. This violence is a crime and a flagrant violation of international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Sexual violence in conflict may constitute war crimes, crimes against humanity, and even genocide. Yet impunity remains widespread. The gap between obligations and commitments on the one hand and reality on the other has only widened during the pandemic. Alongside COVID-19, we have seen the deepening of an SGBV shadow pandemic globally. The pandemic has also shown that major responses can happen quickly. We should use the same sense of urgency to address the SGBV in a transformative way. First, a survivor-centered approach has to guide all efforts. Survivors themselves must have the safe platform to speak up, inform policy, and set the parameters of success. As a key first step for promoting survivors' safety, we call for the implementation of the Secretary General's global ceasefire. Moreover, for responses to be effective, particularly attention must be paid to the many intersecting identities of survivors, and the key role of civil society and context specificity. The Nordics prioritize the utilization of sex and age disaggregated data, close partnership with civil society, and assessment of the unique factors in each country context. Second, accountability. To deliver on promises, we must ensure clearly defined responsibilities and a coherence between responses at different levels. At an individual level, perpetrators of SGBV must be brought to justice. It also requires a holistic approach to rule of law, as well as matching commitments with political will, financial resources, and expertise. The Nordics support capacity building of national judicial systems, the rule of law, and provide specialized SGBV police teams to peacekeeping missions. Political will remains key. Without it, transformative change will not take place. The Nordic countries call on the Security Council to include and apply SGBV as a designation criterion in UN sanctions regime in contexts where such crimes are continuously committed, as this can act like an effective deterrent. Third, we stress that SGBV cannot be discussed in isolation. A comprehensive approach to gender equality and the full implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda in both conflict and non-conflict situations is required to dismantle the unequal structures underpinning SGBV. Similarly, broad work on children's rights and children armed conflicts agenda must be intensified. Member states have the responsibility to ensure rights are upheld and essentially services provided. The Nordic countries particularly stress the need for ensuring sexual and reproductive health and rights, such as access to emergency contraception and the safe termination of pregnancies under all circumstances, including conflicts. We sincerely welcome the Generation Equality Forum with its holistic approach and focus, and we look forward to providing continued strong support. Looking ahead, a return to the previous status quo is not an option. Building back better requires a paradigm shift, where the voice of the survivors and victims are heard and defended, where building an environment that prevents SGBV becomes an integral part of all peace and security discussions, and to borrow SRSG Patton's words, where policies of zero tolerance do not carry zero consequences. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. I'm delighted to give the floor to the permanent representative of the Netherlands, Ambassador Joko Brandt. The floor is yours.
No, thank you very much. And let me start by thanking Maria and the Permanent Mission of Argentina and both SRSGs for hosting us today and for this important commemoration, and importantly for keeping this issue on the agenda, and join others in thanking all the presenters for their insights, and particularly also congratulate SRSG Patton on the digital book. I think it is important that we hear these kinds of testimonies firsthand, and to realize, that behind all the terrible statistics that we see are actually real individuals and real lives. We, of course, fully align ourselves with the EU statement, but just like to make 2 quick points in our national capacity. And first is to underline the importance of a survival-centered approach and promoting survivors' leaderships in processes that affect their lives. After all, it's our common responsibility to ensure that survivors in all their diversity can speak out safely and that their voices are not just heard, but that we also listen and act upon what we hear. And of course, that they are protected when at risks. I think both SRSG spoke of the overlapping crisis that we're faced with. And what we've of course seen is that COVID-19 has increased existing inequalities and worsened the situation of women, especially in conflict settings. It has also further restricted access to essential services, for instance, in the area of sexual and reproductive health and rights, the provision of mental health and psycho support, and made access to justice and redress for crimes even more complicated. Addressing these issues and preventing and responding to sexual violence in conflict is a key priority for the Kingdom of the Netherlands, which we address amongst others through our new Women, Peace and Security program, for which 40 million euros was just recently committed. Secondly, just very quickly to echo also Ambassador Ennestrom's remarks by underlining the importance of peace builders, civil society leaders, and human rights defenders who play critical roles in advancing peace and security, which is why strengthening civil society is such a crucial element for any program that we're implementing and an important part of our Women, Peace and Security program too. Finally, fully agree with the Nordic statement that there will be no transformation without political will, and that we really support the call for the Security Council to play its role there. And we take this opportunity to again state the full commitment of the Netherlands to end sexual violence in conflict, and to do so in full partnership with all of you. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Excellency. I'm delighted now to give the floor to the Deputy Permanent Representative of Ireland, Your Excellency Brian Flynn. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you also to Argentina and SRSG's Patton and Gamba, and a particular thanks to our speakers, briefers today for your really important messages. The theme of this year of Building Back Better and supporting survivors of conflict-related sexual violence in the context of a pandemic recovery, of course, couldn't be more relevant after a year that has been challenging for so many. We know that conflict-related sexual violence often remains underreported due to discrimination and stigma. Over the last year, COVID-19 has added a layer of complexity to that, eliminating safe spaces for survivors, including schools, shelters, and health centres, and further restricting access to services that were already out of reach for so many. Documentation of these heinous crimes, ensuring a survivor-centred approach, and using occasions like today to break down stigma will bring us closer towards our goal of securing an end to CRSV. In our role as co-chair of the Security Council Informal Expert Group on WPS, we've worked closely with SRSG's Patton's Office to raise awareness of issues of sexual violence and call for accountability across the Council's geographic files. We thank the SRSG for the excellent cooperation from her office. Accountability for CRSV remains gravely inadequate. We need to do better. While not a substitute for accountability, sanctions can be a tool to communicate that these crimes are not without cost to their perpetrators. Ireland will work to ensure that better use is made of sanctions regimes to express the international community's rejection of impunity for sexual violence. However, the most effective way to end CRSV will always be the achievement of gender equality. As we plan for a COVID-19 recovery, we need to be bold in using that opportunity to address inequality in all facets of our societies. We have seen how women and girls have disproportionately suffered as a result of this pandemic, all the while serving on its front lines as peace builders, medics, and educators. Building back better from COVID means addressing society's fault lines. Only then can we end CRSV and instill a new social contract for all of society. So I want to thank you for the opportunity for the floor. Thank again our advisors, and also pay tribute and thank all those involved in this digital book, which will be a very useful tool. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Excellency. I'm delighted to give the floor to the Deputy Permanent Representative of Liechtenstein to the United Nations, Your Excellency George Sparber. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor, and many thanks to Argentina and to both SRSGs for bringing us together in this event, in particular for bringing the two agendas together, sexual violence in conflict and children in armed conflict, which highlights the need for us to recognize the intersectional vulnerabilities we're dealing with. Conflict-related violence can take many forms and is perpetrated by different actors and with different motivations. But what it has in common is that it is underpinned by heteropatriarchal ideologies which determine structures of power and control in specific contexts. It is thus important that our work on prevention of sexual and gender-based violence and in supporting survivors goes hand in hand with addressing these power ideologies and gender inequalities. We're fortunate in Liechtenstein to have an NGO called All Survivors Project that works on promoting a multi-sectoral and multidisciplinary response to conflict-related sexual violence. A response that recognizes that also other simultaneous identity categories such as age, disability, race, or religion can also increase vulnerability. While conflict-related sexual violence disproportionately affects girls and is comparatively well documented, less is known about such violence against boys and their experiences, for instance, when associated with fighting forces. In certain contexts, for example, detention settings, men and boys make the majority of victims. Such violence is often underreported owing to fear of stigmatization and cultural taboos. A culture of silence continues to impede accountability and justice. And yet, there are successful cases in ending impunity, such as the ICC's conviction of Bosco and Taganda for the forced enlistment of boys and girls in armed groups and for the perpetration of sexual violence against them. It is also a milestone decision in recognizing sexual and gender-based violence against both male and female child soldiers equally. We very much look forward to continuing our work with all of you, strengthen our fight against sexual and gender-based violence against all victims and survivors, regardless of the identity categories under which they may fall. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Excellency. I'm delighted now to give the floor to Ambassador Tetsuya Kimura of the Permanent Mission of Japan. Kimura-san, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, I would like to express our sincerest appreciation to Ambassador Square, SRSG Ms. Patton, and SRSG Ms. Gamba for convening this important event. I thank also all the briefers for their contributions. Sexual violence in conflict is being exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, making our survivor centers response all the more urgent. We need to foster an enabling environment for survivors, aiming at COVID mitigation and recovery. In addition to co-funding support given to the Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict, this year, Japan provided $890,000 to the UN Action Against Sexual Violence to support their conflict-related sexual violence CRSV response services in Lebanon, Iraq, and Jordan. This project will strengthen the quality and accessibility of life-saving psychosocial and health services for CRSV and GBV survivors and those at risk, while building the capacity of psychosocial case managers to provide quality services and use innovative technological solutions, such as remote case management services. Furthermore, this project will strengthen the capacity of GBV service providers to care for child survivors of CRSV and sexual abuse. In this context, I would like to stress the importance of fostering the resilience of individuals and communities through their empowerment from the perspective of human security to mitigate the social, environmental, and economic impacts. Japan stands ready to work closely with other member states and partner organizations for better recovery from the pandemic. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Excellency, for your statement. And last but not least, inscribed on the speakers list, I'm delighted to give the floor to the Deputy Permanent Representative of Ukraine to the United Nations, Your Excellency Yuri Litrenko. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Moderator, and thank you to co-hosts and briefers of this important event, which is extremely timely and significant for wider UN membership and for the conflict-affected countries in particular, including, unfortunately, my own country. But let me start by reaffirming Ukraine's full commitment to the zero tolerance policy regarding all forms of sexual violence. We recognize that, as the Secretary General put it in his latest report on conflict-related sexual violence, COVID-19 gave rise to new gender-specific protection concerns. In this respect, Ukraine is ready to do its share to address this pressing global challenge. Even more so, given the fact that for already 7 years, my country is suffering from an armed aggression of the Russian Federation, with devastating humanitarian and gender-related consequences. Due to the Russia's armed aggression, Ukraine has turned into the 9th largest country in the world in terms of the number of IDPs, which currently stands at 1.5 million persons. 60% of them are women. Protected population in the temporarily occupied territories faces intimidation, detention, and ill treatment, physical and sexual violence. These occupied territories became home to discriminate practices and gender inequality. And COVID-19 here has only worsened an already appalling situation. Still, Ukraine is doing its best to build back better. On the eve of the 20th anniversary of the Security Council Resolution 1325, we adopted the second National Action Plan for implementing this historic document, which emphasizes the crucial role of women in peacebuilding and conflict resolution. This plan aims in particular at combating gender-based and conflict-related sexual violence. It focuses on achieving greater participation of women in decision-making, in particular in national security, defense, and peacemaking. Moreover, just last month, the Parliament of Ukraine adopted a draft law aimed at enforcement of international criminal and humanitarian law. It will enable Ukraine to achieve accountability for international crimes committed in eastern Ukraine and the temporarily occupied Crimea as a result of the ongoing international armed conflict, offering an efficient domestic recourse to justice to victims of atrocities, including sexual violence. From now on, Ukrainian criminal legislation will cover a full list of war crimes and crimes against humanity, such as sexual violence. Finally, Mr. Moderator, Ukraine is fully committed to joint efforts to ensure that victims and survivors have all the comprehensive support they need to fully recover and are able to reintegrate into their societies. Such efforts should address the specific needs, perspectives, and wishes of the most vulnerable victims and survivors, as well as those living with disabilities. I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for our final segment today. I'm delighted to introduce Ms. Kavya Asoka, the Executive Director of the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace and Security, to give a perspective from civil society. Kavya, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tondra. Good afternoon, Excellencies. Thank you so much for this opportunity to address you, Ambassador Carmen, SRSG Patton, SRSG Gamba. You've heard a lot today about how the COVID-19 pandemic has worsened the structural inequalities that were already marginalizing women and girls and LGBTQI people. But the pandemic has also been exploited by some actors to escalate violence or to initiate new conflicts, while the world was too preoccupied to pay much attention, let alone take action. I want to highlight two examples that have particularly dire consequences for women and girls: the conflict in the Tigray region of Ethiopia and the coup in Myanmar. These examples illuminate the hard reality that although we have a normative framework to criminalize sexual violence in war, we are a long way from deterring or ending these crimes. I commend SRSG Patton for speaking out about the systematic and widespread use of sexual violence in the Tigray region and for calling for investigation and action. USG Lowcock has said that 30% of attacks on civilians in Tigray involve sexual violence, which is being used as a weapon of war to terrorize and traumatize an entire population today and into the next generation. The perpetrators are government forces, members of the Ethiopian and Eritrean Defense Forces, Amhara Special Forces, and other armed groups. We have celebrated 10 years of this mandate, 20 years of the WPS agenda, and repeatedly heard from member states and the UN about turning commitments into compliance and committing to a rights-based, survivor-centered approach. The fact remains that this has not yet happened. I urge you to take a minute to put yourselves in the shoes of a Tigrayan survivor. These women and girls have no place to go. This is happening in their homes, in their hospitals, when walking on the road. If they live in a remote part of the region, they probably have not seen much food or humanitarian assistance. They would be surprised to hear that the UN mobilized emergency humanitarian funds of about $3 million to deliver a survivor-centered approach in a context where new cases of rape are being documented daily. How can women and girls feel safe or reach sexual and reproductive health or psychosocial services in the midst of an active conflict? What do they do while we wait for investigations by OHCHR and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission to conclude? The UN's warning of famine in Tigray must be a wake-up call. Civilians in Tigray have a right to protection, to humanitarian assistance, to comprehensive services to address the gender-based violence that they are facing, and to justice and accountability. Turning to Myanmar, verified sources of the use of sexual violence are fairly scarce, with the statement from the National Unity Government being one of the few public reports of the widespread use of sexual violence to humiliate and terrorize women protesters and detainees. It is remarkable that there are any reports at all, given the risks to anyone speaking out. As you all well know, this is part of the well-documented pattern of sexual and gender-based violence committed by the Myanmar military with impunity against ethnic women and girls and transgender persons. As the UN fact-finding mission in Myanmar concluded in 2019, sexual violence is a hallmark of the Tatmadaws military operations. Women leaders have told us that the scale of the repression they see today is completely different to what they saw in the 1988 uprising. This is the challenge to you as the international community. What are those of you gathered here today committed to human rights, a survivor-centered approach to ending gender-based violence, going to do to prioritize women's rights over political dialogue with those who abuse it in Myanmar? Finally, last year on this day, the NGO Working Group cautioned that the international community must be vigilant that the language of protection and vulnerability does not relegate women, including survivors of sexual violence and conflict, to objects of protection rather than as agents of change. I reiterate that call today, especially in the context of women human rights defenders and politically active women who are punished for who they are, what they say, and what they do in Libya, in Afghanistan, Yemen, Myanmar, and so many other situations where gender-based violence is used to target and silence them. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Kavya, and your words, call to action, are an appropriate end note for this year's commemoration event. I think I have nothing left to do but to close this year's event, to thank all of our speakers for their contribution and for the many people who have logged in for today's event. Thank you very much.